welcome once again to EWTN's Bookmark, and I'm Doug Keck, your host, welcoming our very special guest through the magic of television. We're joined by Father James Mallon, author of Divine Renovation, Bringing Your Parish from Maintenance to Mission, published by 23rd Publications. And welcome, Father, to EWTN's Bookmark.
It's great to be here, Doug. Thank you.
Now, Father, you're actually from Canada, right? And you are recognizable by many of our audience because of a couple of series here on EWTN, including Dogmatic Theology.
That's right.
It's with Monzi, of course, of late memory, and then, of course, we also have Cross Training, which you had worked on for us, and now the latest one would be the one on grandparenting. How did you get so involved with media?
Oh, wow. I think I probably blame Steve Jobs for that. The fact that I've always been fascinated with the power of story to captivate minds and hearts, and especially to draw people into the gospel. And the fact that there's stories everywhere, they're all around us. And I was just itching to be able to tell those stories. And with the advent of digital media and with editing on laptops and small cameras, you know, what would have cost, as you guys know, in the 70s, a lot of money to do, you could do very, very easily. So I felt that there was a moral obligation to use these means of communication. And I started doing it myself. I started teaching myself and kind of expanded it. And eventually I realized, well, you know, once I had a big edit suite and was using professional gear and software, I thought, well, I can probably teach others. And there was an idea of what could we do if we got like-minded people who were passionate in this and brought them in, gave them the tools to tell the stories, because the stories are out there and the stories are powerful.
You know, it strikes me that kind of dovetails into the whole idea of your book, Divine Renovation. The idea of reimaging the parish in the sense of evangelization.
Yes.
Not just a clerical approach, but involving a true call of the laity, basically an extension of Vatican II, what EWTN does and what you do, evangelizing into the culture.
Yes, it is very interesting. About a month ago, I was thinking about all the kind of things that I've been passionate about in the 17 years that I've been a priest, and I realized it's all been about divine renovation. The word renovation, renovare in Latin, means to make new again. To make new again. See, as Catholics, in our Catholic tradition, we don't, in order to find newness, we don't throw it out and start over again. As tempting as that may be, we renovate, we make a thing new. And of course, it's not us that make the thing new, it's the Lord makes all things new. As Jesus says in the book of Revelation, behold, I make all things new. So he is the divine renovator. And that is what has always been a passion for me, and whether it's been the different media things that we've undertaken or the different ministries that I've been involved in, it's that conviction that the Lord wants to renew the church, wants to renew us.
Working for a Franciscan nun, as we do here at EWTN, we think of St. Francis, the idea of Francis, rebuild my church. Now, in your book, you have House of Cards. Now, when you're talking about the House of Cards, are you saying the church is a house of cards? In fact, the quote is, we don't need to know about Jesus. What we need is cards. Did that actually happen?
That's right. That's a true story. I'll never forget this. Dear little old lady, she pounded the table and she said that to me because I wanted to put on a program of evangelization in my church hall in this little country parish, and it was being used as a social center for card socials. And I remember it used to drive me crazy. I'd come in on Monday nights and the hall would be filled with about 80, 90 people, most of whom never came to church, but they came to the church hall to play cards. And I just had this desire that I wish they could come to know the Lord, because it's much better than cards. But this little old lady didn't think so. And for me, it was a symbolic story, because a lot of my years as a priest, the first 13, 14 years, whenever I went to a new parish, I had to fight to regain control of our facilities, of our buildings, because they'd become social centers for card socials or scouts or cubs, and all of these things are good. They're not bad things, but these buildings exist to be used for the mission of the church, and that's what I had to fight for. And my conviction was that we have confusion about the use of our buildings because there is an identity confusion in the church about what is the ultimate purpose of the church itself.
Right. You called it the Great Card Confrontation. Is it true that the Card Foundation had been going on for centuries and included some of the original members?
Absolutely, yes. They were very well preserved, or at least that was the popular myth anyway. Because that one decision, it was, you would think that it had been going on since the 14th century anyway.
You also talk about the fact that you were mystified over the fact that they were simply unwilling to move that particular night. You found out later, after going to another parish, that these socials were all on different nights in all different parishes.
Absolutely, true story. In fact, even going into my very last parish, the parish I'm in now, this is like 10 years later, I found out that there was going to be a card social, and we negotiated to use the building, and we walked in, and many of the same people were the exact same people from 10 years before. So, but I like to say for the record that I have nothing against cards. I really don't, but I don't think they take priority over proclaiming the gospel or helping people to grow in maturity in their faith.
Well, it's interesting you talk about in chapter 1 in the book, you talk about a house of prayer, remembering our identity and purpose. And the quote is, "My house shall be called a house of prayer." In some cases, the buildings had become social centers where they had nothing to do with the people who actually went to Mass.
Yeah, and even, you know, the subtitle, the Canadian book is called From Maintenance to Mission. The U.S. volume is called Bringing Your Parish from Maintenance to Mission. The very fact that many parishes have settled to be maintenance churches, and that is not just maintaining buildings, but maintaining the flock even. And sometimes, let's be honest, in some places, we're not even doing that. We're not even maintaining the flock, where people are dropping like flies sometimes. But even if we are maintaining the flock, that's still not being faithful to what the Lord calls us to do. The church is a mission. In fact, the church doesn't just has a mission; it is a mission. And you know, and something that Pope Francis said, and he said this actually after I wrote the introduction to the book, where he did say that unless the church has this as its primary focus, it will fall like a house of cards. He did say, and so we're called to be missional. And that reference to the cleansing of the temple by Jesus in the first chapter. I make a point there that this is not the first time that the people of God have lost their missional identity, because I believe that through the great exclusive choice of Israel as God's people, there was an inherent, incredibly inclusive promise. You see that in the prophets, that one day all peoples will come to the mountain of the Lord, and that this will be a house of prayer for all peoples. And when Jesus quotes these scriptures from Isaiah and Jeremiah, in Mark's version of the cleansing of the temple, you know, many people think it's because he took offense at the money changers in the temple, but this was part of life in the temple. Jesus had been going to the temple all his life. He wasn't shocked. In fact, in Mark's gospel, he was there the night before. He looked around, he realized it was supper time, and he went to Bethany for supper, came back the next morning, and started overturning the temple, started overturning the tables. This was not something done in a moment of shock or outrage. This was a planned, very determined action by Jesus. In fact, he didn't just overturn the money changers' tables, he shut down the entire workings of the temple. He wouldn't let anyone, St. Mark says, come or go. So he shut down the temple by referencing the fact that Isaiah says that my house is meant to be a house of prayer for all peoples, but you've made it a den of thieves. If you think of the actual structure of the temple with all of the courtyard of the Gentiles, the courtyard of the Israelites, the courtyard of the women, the courtyard of the men, the courtyard of the priests, and the Holy of Holies, all of this great inclusiveness that Israel was supposed to bring about had become, in the very architecture of the temple, and the embodiment of exclusivity, that Israel was content to keep it to themselves. This is a very important thing, because in the church today, often if you look at parishes, it seems that we're pretty content to just keeping it all to ourselves. And we pat ourselves on the back for keeping it to ourselves. But we are missional. In fact, it's not even that the Church of Jesus Christ is a mission, that the mission of Jesus Christ as a church.
So I was wondering, is that how you actually felt as the pastor of a church, like the captain of the Titanic?
Well, no, because the obviously people say, you know, rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic, as if we're saying the church is the Titanic. No, I'm saying the church is the lifeboats. The world is the Titanic. But in the story of the Titanic, you know, actually where I live, the graveyards where the bodies that they did recover from the Titanic disaster are buried a couple of 100 meters from where I live. You can come and visit if you wish. There's even a guy called Jack Dawson there, but it's not Leonardo DiCaprio. But what struck me in looking at the story of the Titanic is that almost 1/3 of the spaces on the lifeboats were empty. 1/3 of the seats were empty. And the boat sat off at a distance as the Titanic slid underneath the water. Almost 1,500 souls were floundering in those seas, in those perishing seas, and they had minutes to live before they succumbed to hypothermia. And the lifeboats, whose very mission was to save people, sat at a safe distance and did nothing. Nothing. In fact, I'm sure if any of the people swam towards them, they may have pulled them in. But it was actually one sailor got a couple of the boats together, transferred passengers, and he did take a boat over eventually, and they recovered, I think, about 5 people. 2 of them later died, so 3 people were saved. But the point was that even the suggestion to go towards the floundering people resulted in a chorus of complaints by the other passengers. And when I thought of this, I thought of that as a metaphor of the church, not the Titanic, but the fact that we in the church are in the lifeboats. We're tasked to go and to help those who are perishing. Remember, God so loved the world that he gave his only Son so that those who believe in him may not perish but have eternal life. And the church has been given that mission to bring that salvation. And so often we're content to sit at a safe distance and watch and drink tea and play cards in our lifeboats.
Well, it seems they feared that the sinking ship's whirlpool would actually pull them under as well.
Going out will always involve a risk. It always will involve a risk. And sometimes we legitimize our non-action by saying, well, we've got to be careful, we can't take a risk. But you know, we have a pope now who is saying, I want a church that goes out. I want a church that goes to the existential peripheries, that goes out. I don't want a church that is fixated on its own self-preservation, but is truly and thoroughly, inherently missionary. And that's a challenge for us because it is safe and comfortable to sit at a distance in our lifeboats, but it always will be risky to go out.
Right. When you talk about mission in the book, you ask the question, is it to go, to make, to baptize, or to teach? And you say the answer is to make. Why is that the correct answer and important in the making of disciples in your mind?
Well, I think the Great Commission, that's Matthew chapter 28, in truth, it's all 4, isn't it? Jesus tells us to go, to make, to baptize, and teach, and we have to do all 4 of those. But what's interesting, if you look at you don't always see this in English translations, but of course in the original language, one of the sentences, as in every sentence, there's a finite verb, and the other verbs are actually participles. They're verbal nouns, and they're somewhat dependent, in a sense, on the finite verb. So grammatically and theologically, therefore, there is a center of the Great Commission. All 4 things are required, but the one thing is around which all the others revolve. And often when I speak to people or speak to groups, I'll ask this question. I'll say, which of the 4 do you think is the center, is the heart of the Great Commission that Jesus gave us? And the answer is to make disciples, mathetusete in Greek. And so Jesus is saying, in a sense, go and make disciples, and when you make disciples, baptize and teach them. And this central insight is actually spoken about in the Catechism as well, when we talk about liturgy and sacraments, that they ought to be preceded by evangelization and catechesis. The call is to make disciples. And yet, if you think about most of us in our parishes, the fact that there are parishes all over the place, we're very good at baptizing and teaching, but our one weakness is making disciples. And if you look at how we do things in most parishes, one could conclude that the Catholic version of the Great Commission is go, baptize, and teach.
Now, as you say in a chapter in your book, crank out the practicing Catholic. That was underpinned by a basic culture that supported at least that outward kind of lifestyle. Well, in the 60s, that all but disappeared.
That's right. All of the props that held that up were pulled away. And so we've seen this great, really what amounts to a great apostasy in many ways, because people weren't at all equipped to survive in this new world. If you think of the word disciple, mathetes in Greek, it's a Greek word which comes from a verb to learn. I think of my own life. You know, I'm sorry to say, but when I was a kid, I hated Sunday school. I used to skip it. And I resented having to get up on Sunday morning to go to school. It just didn't seem fair. But one of the basic reasons was I had no hunger, I had no desire to learn. But when I encountered Jesus and when I came into that personal relationship with Jesus, I couldn't get enough. and I'm sure that every single person watching right now on EWTN, anyone who watches this channel faithfully, you know exactly what I'm talking about, because you watch it because you have a hunger to learn, a hunger to learn. And that's what marks a disciple, someone who's encountered Jesus and has a hunger to learn. And when I speak to priests, I'll often say, let's be honest with ourselves. What percentage of our parishioners does that describe? What percentage of our parishioners actually have a hunger to learn and to grow in the relationship with Jesus? And answers will go between 2 to 6% of parishioners. These are church-going people, 2 to 6%. And that's shocking. And that leaves a large majority of our people who are in church with a kind of a sense of, well, I'm here because I have to be here, I ought to be here, and Father, can we just move things along so that I can get out of here and go home?
Right, within 45
or
minutes.
Or even 35 minutes would be even better. You know, Father, I've thought if I'd said, next week I'm going to preach a 10-minute homily, people say, oh, that's wonderful. And the next week I'd say, well, my homily is going to be 5 minutes. People say, well, that's even better. That's great. And I think if I said, well, do you know something? I'm just going to do away with the homily altogether. There'd be a certain number of Catholics who'd be absolutely thrilled about that. But you see, they have no hunger. And sometimes we have, in our churches, capitulated to this. We have, in fact, built models of pastoral care to feed people who are not hungry. And for parents, you know what that's like. If you cook a meal for your child and you find out the child has been eating potato chips or something, and the child arrives at the table and is not hungry, it's very frustrating. And you know that your child is not being nourished. And there's also that sense of, you've worked hard to prepare this food, and that is delicious, wonderful food, and you so want your child to experience this. And it can be very heartbreaking. And I know that a lot of priests, a lot of my brother priests, who went into the priesthood with this sense of calling, that I want to raise up what Pope Francis calls missionary disciples, and yet we run into a brick wall of kind of complacency and mediocrity and sometimes minimalism.
Reductionism, you call it, when someone was ordained, quote unquote, fresh meat, right? We'll see how long he holds up.
That is a true story. At an ordination, the laying on of hands, a priest behind me, one of the young guys who's a good friend of mine, he's got a good sense of humor, but he said under his voice, fresh meat, and we all kind of started laughing. But there was something sad about it, because there was that sense of, we went into this to serve the mission of Jesus Christ, and yet it seems like it's sacrifice to a system, to a structure, to an infrastructure of parishes. Let's plug holes and keep it all standing. And it's like the mission is submitted to the infrastructure. It's like the infrastructure, maintaining the structure is the greater value.
Right. You talk about it later in the book. You have some survey info from Gallup that most priests overestimate what they can do in 1 year, but underestimate what they should be able to accomplish in 5 years.
I wouldn't say the church as a whole, because I really believe that, a shoot shall come from the stump of Jesse, Isaiah chapter 11, that even though we see the pattern, the Paschal mystery, the dying and rising within the church itself and in institutions, the Holy Spirit always gives life, and so the church is always going to be sprouting new life. You can't keep it down. And I think in the last 50 years, we've seen a lot of that renewal and new life come through movements. Look at what's happened here and the wonderful things that God has done. My struggle has been that parishes, not the church as a whole, but parishes have become places of mediocrity and minimalism. And so that when parishioners came alive in their faith, when they had that encounter with Jesus, when they became zealous and enthusiastic and fell in love with their faith and wanted to live a life of discipleship and have authentic community beyond coffee socials and cards at socials, the average Catholic looked at them and said, you're weird. And they had to go to the thing on Tuesday night or the thing on Wednesday afternoon. They went and joined movements outside the church, whatever movement they are. I mean, and thanks be to God, we've had these renewal movements within the church. But generally, people had to leave their parish. They would go back to the parish to receive the sacraments, to receive the Eucharist on Sunday morning, but where they received discipleship, where they did evangelization, where they experienced essential community, and where they were evangelized generally was not within the parish. And so for me, that was my experience when I was a young man. I was evangelized through the Crucial movement. And I always, as a young priest, thought, how could we bring these essential elements into parish life? And that's really been my struggle. So it's not so much that the church as a whole is not experiencing renewal, but how do we renew parishes? How do we see this? Because renewal is happening. The Lord is always bringing renewal to His church. But how can we bring this as parishes? And how can we move a parish from maintenance to mission? Because in the end, I said that people who come alive are considered odd by the average Catholic. But what if we were able to change the culture of a parish, that is, all the things we consider normal, so that what we once considered to be abnormal was normal? And what would be abnormal would be a Catholic who's not on fire for Jesus, who doesn't grow and who doesn't serve.
Now, in the book, you talk about having a personal relationship with God, and that people who are uncomfortable with that because it sounds too Protestant evangelical. But how would this be different from the kumbaya approach of the 70s?
Yeah, I think we're in a very different place. I think we're finally able to take the central insights of the Second Vatican Council and live them out responsibly. I think it takes a generation, 40 years in a desert, to really assimilate an ecumenical council, and I think we're there. And I think we're far beyond everything that happened in the 70s. And we've been blessed by Pope John Paul II, but who's reminded us what we believe. Pope Benedict, who drilled deeper and said, this is why we believe it. And lastly, Pope Francis, who now is saying, okay, let's go do it.
It's interesting, too, that you really carry forward from Pope Paul VI to show the continuity and not the rupture.
Absolutely. A beautiful continuity, yes.
So how long did it actually take you to put this book together?
Probably about 4 months when I actually did it. I wrote about half of it on airplanes and airports and half at home at night. And it was a wonderful experience, a trying experience, but a good one.
Do you think you're going to write another book? Or what do you think?
I figure it must be like childbirth. You've got to wait long enough to forget the pain before you're willing to do it again.
We'll make sure that if you write another one, you stop by here for Bookmark. As always, great to see you, Father. Thanks for your great work. And thank you for your wonderful series here on EWTN, including the one on grandparenting, a very important aspect of our faith, making disciples anyway.
Absolutely. Thank you, Doug.
Thanks so much. We're speaking here with Father James Mallon, author of a very fine book entitled Divine Renovation, Bringing Your Parish from Maintenance to Mission, a must-read. Get it through our EWTN religious catalog, EWTNRC.com. I'm Doug Keck. Thank you for joining us for this very special EWTN Bookmark.